But what I noticed, and this is relevant to Bloodborne, trust me on this, is that the sharper that eye gets, the more you learn, the more you understand about architecture, the more madness you sort of develop. Bloodborne is what you get when you mix Miyazaki and H.P. Lovecraft to create what is essentially a 40-hour nightmare Dark Souls horror RPG experience. Bloodborne is one of the greatest games ever made, and I think Bloodborne cemented Miyazaki's place in the pantheon of great video game developers. I first played Bloodborne in 2017, and Bloodborne was actually the first Souls-like I actually ever played. I played it on PlayStation 4, and I struggled. I really struggled with Bloodborne. Bloodborne is a very challenging video game for a number of reasons that we're going to talk about in a second. The problem with Bloodborne is that it's not massively accessible to sort of newcomers in a way. You really have to be persistent with it. It doesn't teach you a lot. Its systems are quite complex, quite difficult to understand. And of course, it's just a hard game. Like, you're just going to get kicked around and killed again and again and again and again. But I would argue that that very thing that puts quite a lot of people off from ever playing Bloodborne and the Souls games also contributes to the magic secret sauce that makes them so great and so special. So as I mentioned on the Dark Souls video previously, we have the architect, Miyazaki, and then I believe he was working on Dark Souls 2, kind of gave himself the ick, and then jumped over to Bloodborne. No, that's not true. I know Dark Souls 2 is not a very popular entry in the Soulsborne series, but from how I understand it, Miyazaki was involved in Dark Souls 2, and then the opportunity came from PlayStation to develop Bloodborne as a first-party title, and I think then Miyazaki put all of his attention into Bloodborne, and that's why you could argue Dark Souls 2 doesn't have a lot of the same magic that Dark Souls 1 had, but what I'm getting at here is that Bloodborne really is the sort of spiritual successor to Dark Souls, in my opinion. Bloodborne shares quite a lot of the same architectural DNA as Dark Souls, and that's no more evident in the map, or should I say the lack of it. We talked in the previous video about Dark Souls and that it didn't have a map. Dark Souls doesn't have a map, and neither does Bloodborne. And both games, as mentioned, rely on architecture to visually guide you through the game and the levels. This is a fan map made for Dark Souls, and then this is a fan map made for Bloodborne. And I think what you can sort of see here by looking at both maps side by side is that they are quite similar in a way. We have a series of interconnected spaces, and then we have a series of spaces that are only accessed via teleportation. But overall, I'd say Bloodborne is the closest game to Dark Souls in terms of hitting the magic of that interconnected game world. So all we have to work with for Bloodborne and its plans and its maps are fan-created maps and plans of each of the environments that are all available on the Bloodborne wiki, which I recommend anybody who's a fan of Bloodborne check out because it's a fantastic resource. But really what you can see here is a lot of the same visual language shared between the two games. A lot of loops, a lot of spirals, a lot of shortcuts, a lot of verticality. But what really makes the architecture of Bloodborne unique from Dark Souls is, on surface level, the style, the vibes, the atmosphere. Now, I don't want to spend an awful lot of time talking about the actual look of Bloodborne. So much has been said already about its gothic, Lovecraftian, nightmarish art style. And we're going to just touch on it a little bit here, but I mean, it's absolutely just a sensational video game to look at. And what's also noticeable is how Miyazaki and the team actually really utilized and harnessed the power of the PlayStation 4 to basically make everything wet. Everything's wet. And that just lends so much to the sort of art direction of the game. Everything's wet with blood, with water, with rain, all sorts of fluids. The game's really gross in the best sort of way. Again, like Dark Souls, there are real-world architectural references throughout. But what's really notable about Bloodborne is that it all takes place in one city, the city of Yharnam. I mean, just look at it. It's incredible. The world map does use a lot of the same techniques from Dark Souls, what we discussed with the sequencing, compression and release, spirals, weenies. They're all in Bloodborne also. You could probably make the argument that Bloodborne is almost a reskin of Dark Souls, environmentally speaking, but I think that would be really unfair because there are a number of different factors that really distinguish Bloodborne from the Souls series. And one of those, obviously, is the gameplay. As you can see here on screen, it is absolutely frantic. It's aggressive, it's violent, it's fast, it's just so good. Whereas Dark Souls is much more of a methodical, slow experience. I compare it to like chess versus air hockey. It's like just night and day different. When I first played Bloodborne, I just didn't get it. I just couldn't get my head around how this world was supposed to work. I just continued to die. And I just continued to die again and again and again. And eventually, I just got fed up. Like, I just couldn't understand how I was supposed to progress through it. The world just felt so hostile, like it didn't want me to be there. And I think that's one of the most wonderful and unique things about the world of Bloodborne, is that this world just exists with or without you, the player. And I think that's quite unusual when you consider that most video games are power fantasies of sorts. They sort of exist to facilitate your needs, your wants, your desires, whereas the world of Bloodborne is like, nah, we don't care that you're here, and we're going to let you feel that in every single aspect of the world's design. I was absolutely addicted to it though. The idea of conquering these ridiculously complex boss challenges and just sort of being rewarded with access to more of the world was just like a drug that only sort of exists in games like Bloodborne. And really, the more I played it, the more it sort of reminded me of architecture school in a way. I started studying architecture in 2010, and I was 19 years old at the time. And I really just didn't understand anything about architecture. Like, I just sort of knew it had something to do with buildings. And my taste in buildings and architecture was entirely based on what I had been exposed to in the city that I grew up in. So my idea of a good building was a new building, and I didn't really think much more of it than that, really. If you start studying architecture, you'll notice this sort of a phenomenon that occurs, that as you sort of get better at it, the way in which you see the world around you changes. And that happens very quickly. And all of a sudden, the city that you grew up in changes. Not that it actually changes physically, it was always there to begin with, but your ability to now see what's there has changed as a consequence of studying architecture at university. And I think this is a common thing that happens to all architecture students at a certain point. But for me, it actually happened quite quickly. I remember having a conversation once with a professor about prisons and the design of prisons as architecture, and should they or should they not be built. And the professor was sort of pressing me on this idea I had that I don't think prisons should exist. And I eventually reached this conclusion in this conversation that prisons are quite peculiar in that they are designed almost in a hostile way for prisoners, but also have that dual responsibility of being a place of work for the guards and the people who actually work in the prison. And I always thought there was something really interesting in that sort of dichotomy, that gap between who is architecture for? Is architecture supposed to be good? Is architecture supposed to be hostile? Can architecture be designed for two different groups at the same time? I'm just meandering a bit here, but what I'm saying is that was sort of that moment where I realized that architecture, there's much more depth to it as a subject than simply just looking at buildings. And over the years, I developed my eye basically by studying architecture, by sketching architecture, by visiting buildings, cities, and sort of really developing and honing that analytical eye. But what I noticed, and this is relevant to Bloodborne, trust me on this, is that the sharper that eye gets, the more you learn, the more you understand about architecture, the more madness you sort of develop, like once you're exposed to, a phenomenal, wonderful, magical piece of architecture, you begin to develop this form of madness by asking yourself, why can't we have more of that? Why doesn't more of that exist? Why do we have so many sad buildings? Why do we have so much sad architecture? My madness in architecture peaked when I had to, get a job in architecture and to work in a practice. So when I purchased Bloodborne in 2017 and began to play it, I struggled. Bloodborne is a ridiculously difficult video game, and most people who engage with it will just bounce straight off of it. Like, they just won't want to engage with it. But Bloodborne is a great piece of art, and like all great artwork, it's challenging. And as an architect and as someone who really enjoyed architecture school, I always embraced that challenge, and I was determined to overcome the challenges of Bloodborne and engage with it and try to understand what it was trying to do. And as I began to play the game more and more and more over that Christmas break, I began to develop a form of madness. I was completely obsessed with this game, and I was completely obsessed with the gameplay loop. I was completely obsessed with the architecture. I was completely obsessed with the world of Yharnam. I was just completely addicted to it, and it was all I could think about for weeks. And the more I began to play it and learn about its systems and master its lore, the madder I sort of became. And I do think that's a large part of the magic of the architecture of Bloodborne. If you notice, like, the gameplay mechanics facilitate that process through insight and madman's knowledge. The more you play the game, the more you explore, the more you engage with the systems and the architecture and the design, the more insight you will develop. The more insight you develop, more in the game becomes apparent. And the best example of that is later in the game, the appearance of the giant Cthulhu-like amygdala creatures that are now all throughout the game, but in reality were always in the game to begin with. They were always there. Just as a hunter, you had to develop the insight and the knowledge to see what no one else could already see. And that's how I look at architecture, and that's how I believe a lot of the great architects work today. It's not that they're just able to sort of create great things. It's that they're able to see things that others can't see that were probably already there. There's a level of insight and knowledge and madness that sort of has to occur for an architect to be able to communicate something that no one else can quite understand. And I think that level of insight and knowledge comes at a cost. And in the game, it certainly comes at a cost. The idea of the creative genius is this toxic idea that's been in architecture and art for a long time. And I'm not necessarily advocating for that. I'm not saying that that's a good thing. It's just an observation, really. But in Bloodborne, the better you get, the harder you work, the more insight you develop, the more knowledge you get, the madder you become, the more hostile the world becomes. And I find that really interesting. Bloodborne is the architecture of madness, and I wouldn't change a thing about it. Like, I just think it's one of the greatest video games ever made, and I think it's important to talk about it critically and to talk about it through an architectural lens. So that's what I kind of think. In Bloodborne and in Yharnam and in architecture, I think madness is just the cost of this aggressive pursuit of knowledge and greatness. I think that's kind of cool. So this is the architecture of Bloodborne. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. That would be much appreciated. And let me know in the comments what you want to see next time. And I hope you enjoyed it. All the best, and goodbye.